Good evening, everyone. We're going to pick back up in our Proverbs Bible study tonight in chapter 6. Chapter 6. We've been reading through this speech that Solomon was giving to his sons. And Solomon, in this particular talk, has been warning his sons of a few things that can rob a young man of a good and happy life. And the way that Solomon describes them are sort of like hunters. He uses this language of prowling and stalking and snares and traps and thieves. And so he's kind of wording it in that manner. And so far, what we've seen through Solomon's speech is the first hunter is debt. Debt can rob you of a good and comfortable life. And he warns some of the ways that you can fall into that and advises on how you can get out of that. He then warned about laziness and the dangers of laziness and how we can look to the ant for lessons in how to be productive. Then he moved from there into discussing different types of evil speech, things like stirring up strife and gossip and deception and lies, and warning against the dangers of that. And so that brings us to the end of his speech, where he's going to mention the last hunter. And we were able to just briefly get into this. It starts in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20. And he mentions that this fourth hunter is lust. And so this is something that Solomon has touched on a couple of times throughout other speeches, this idea of avoiding the adulteress. And he almost uses this adulteress character really as the opposite of wisdom. And we'll see that contrast here in this speech and then again later as we move on. But he warns his sons to avoid lust. And so if we pick back up here in verse 20, he says, "My son, comply with the commandment of your father, and do not ignore the teaching of your mother. Bind them continually on your heart, tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will talk to you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light. And rebukes for discipline are the way of life." And so we talked about this a little bit. Solomon, throughout his speeches, has many times likened wisdom to wearing jewelry, right? If you have wisdom, it's like wearing this fancy jewelry. Everyone can see it. It's very noticeable, and it makes you look better. It's a good thing for you. And so when you wear this, you also keep it close. And so he uses this analogy with wisdom. And so once again, he's encouraging his sons to wear wisdom, okay? We also talked about the fact that some people can see rules or commandments as stifling. Following the rules of the Bible is, well, that limits my choices in life. If I follow the Bible, then I can't do everything that I want to do. I'm stuck in this narrow lane and I can't go out of that, and that's frustrating to me, right? Some people see the Bible's teachings in that manner. And yet Solomon sees it in a different light. He says that commandments and teaching are enlightening things. They are like a light to his feet. He also mentions that rebukes, something that, maybe we don't enjoy at the time, but rebukes are there as discipline for life. When you are rebuked, if you learn from it, it leads to good things. And so he's encouraging his sons here. So after this brief little moment of encouragement in his speech, this is when he dives in and starts talking in earnest about lust. And so let's look at starting in verse 24. Starting in verse 24 of Proverbs chapter 6, it says, "To keep you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the foreign woman. Do not desire her beauty in your heart, nor let her capture you with her eyelids. For the price of a prostitute reduces one to a loaf of bread, and an adulteress hunts for a precious life." Okay? So this is, again, he's reiterating things he's already said in other speeches. He's warning of the kind of person that the adulteress is, how to recognize this type of person. It's someone who's going to be a sweet talker, someone who will be enticing with words and with looks. And so he's trying to warn his sons of what to recognize, okay? Which is what the application really is for us. When we want to avoid lust, we need to know how we're going to be tempted, right? And so he's warning us of things to watch out for. He's also warning us what not to be like, right? We don't want to be the person who's enticing someone else to lust, right? That's not the way that we want to behave. And so this is a good lesson, whether you're male or female, right? Whether you're Christian or not, this is a good lesson in life of how not to be, okay? And we see here the consequence, all right? So in verse 26, what happens if this hunter captures you? What happens if the adulteress snares you, or if lust snares you?
Well, my brother said you're reduced to a crust of bread.
You're reduced to a crust of bread.
You know, not
right?
just the whole loaf, but the crust.
Right. Yeah. So, in other words, poverty, right? And he also says loss of life, because at the very end of verse 26, he says the adulteress hunts for a precious life. Go ahead, Rick.
And if you think about it, you're consumed. That's
right.
The idea of that crust of bread, right? You know,
right.
That's that little bit of bread that the starving person can have or whatever.
Yeah.
Think of that, but you're consumed by this.
Yeah, it consumes you, right? And that has multiple meanings that all apply, right? It can take over your entire life. It can take over your focus. It can rob you of your actual earthly wealth. There's a lot of consequences that can come with this, right? And loss of life as well, especially when we think of the spiritual application, right? If this consumes your life, then you are now losing it, okay? In verse 27 and 28, he makes it even more plain. He says, can anyone take fire in his lap and his clothes not be burned? Or can a person walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? We still have sayings like this today, right? If you play with fire, you're going to get burned, right? We have similar sayings today. It's still relevant. So he's warning his sons here, because there can be that temptation of, well, as long as I'm careful, that won't be my end, right? I won't be reduced to a loaf of bread because I'll be smart about this. And he's saying, you're going to get burned if you're playing with fire, right? And if you notice in verse 26, he actually mentions two types of immoral people there. Look at verse 26. What are the two types of immoral people that he mentions? What's that? The harlot and the adulteress, right? What's the difference? They seem pretty similar.
I don't think I can include the adulteress is usually a married person that is out sinning.
Right.
Other people.
Right.
The harlot is one who's making.
Right. Now they could be.
They could be.
They could be the same, right? But essentially the harlot or the prostitute is just making a living out of this, right? The adulteress is the married woman. She's the one out having the affair, right? He's actually warning his sons about two types of ways you can get into this trouble, right? Back in those days, it was more common in cities for prostitution to be a normal legal thing, right? Especially if you look at, even in the New Testament, in the Greek society, in the Roman society, this was a much more normal thing. And so he's warning them against this, but he's also warning them against getting involved with someone else's wife, right? Don't do that either. Both of these paths lead to no good. It's the same thing. So he's trying to warn his sons about really two situations here.
There's actually, and both can apply to both sexes. Because remember,
absolutely,
they had temple male prostitutes.
Right.
But anyway, they did. So.
Right. Yeah. Just because Solomon is talking to sons here doesn't mean you can't reverse the lesson, right? This lesson applies male or female, right? Whatever your situation is, it applies to both. He says here, Solomon's going to go on and he's going to compare the consequences of theft versus adultery to kind of drive home the severity of it. Okay, so let's look at that. In verse 29, he says, "So is the one who goes into his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her will not go unpunished. People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is hungry. But when he is found out, he must repay 7 times as much. He must give up all the property of his house. One who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself commits it. He will find wounds and disgrace, and his shame will not be removed. For jealousy enrages a man, and he will not have compassion on the day of vengeance. He will not accept any settlement, nor will he be satisfied though you make it a large gift." Okay? So he's comparing the consequences of stealing versus adultery. And just keep in mind, he's comparing this under the old law, right? So if you need more detail on that, just go back and read through the book of Leviticus, and it gives all of the background there. So first, he talks about the thief, right? A thief who steals when they're hungry, right? So not someone who's just like, oh, I saw something really neat and I wanted it. This is someone who's desperate and is stealing so that they can eat, okay? So if someone steals because they're hungry and they just want food, what are the consequences of that? According to Solomon here, what are the consequences under the old law?
He's still going to have to pay back.
He's still going to have to pay it back, right? Okay, what else?
Well, 7-fold, he's going to have to pay it back.
Okay, so he's got to pay it back 7-fold, right? And that's listed in the law.
Yeah.
That was a thing you had to do. Shirley, did you have your hand up? Anybody else? What is people's attitude towards someone who steals for being hungry?
You should have a little more compassion for him, a little more understanding.
Yeah. If someone steals because they're hungry, you understand why they did that. Maybe it's still wrong and you don't approve of it, but you understand what drove them to it. You're not really mad at them. Like, they still have to repay it. There's consequences to it. But it says people don't despise a thief. Yeah, okay, you were in a tight spot. You got to pay it back. You got to deal with the consequences, but everybody gets it, right? Everyone understands. There's no hard feelings there, so to speak, right? So people don't hold it against them. And I would say that in general, that's probably still true today. Most people, if you steal out of need, like for survival, most people aren't going to really hold that against you. They're going to be a little bit more compassionate and understanding. Let's compare that to adultery now. According to Solomon, what's the attitude towards someone who commits adultery? Especially from the spouse, right, who got cheated on. What's the attitude there?
Well, it's not appreciated at all. I mean, we're getting there's going to be wounds and dishonor, and he goes on to talk about fury and things.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you're going to be considered very dishonorable.
Right.
We say a dirty rat or whatever.
It says, for jealousy enrages a man. So there's the wrath part, right? And he will not have compassion on the day of vengeance. So when it's time for justice, people aren't going to be compassionate over this, right? The spouse isn't going to be compassionate, even if the repayment is a large amount of money, right? If under the old law, if he's trying to make things right and paying a large sum of money, that's not going to make the husband feel better, right? It's not going to make it better. So adultery has more lingering consequences. So you think in their situation, their society, if you live in a town and you cheat with someone else's wife, that husband who was cheated on, you can't just make that go away, right? Even if you pay the debt, even if you try and right that wrong, there's still going to be hard feelings there. That's going to follow you, right, Rick?
Yeah, because it plainly says he will accept no recompense for, they won't accept being paid.
Yeah.
And that can go for the husband or the wife, whoever is being cheated on. But we see too that sometimes it drives people to such a rage that they kill people.
Right.
So it's something to be aware of. You're kind of taking life in your hands when you're dealing with things like that. People's emotions can be wild. So.
Right. I think, Pat, you had your hand up first, and then Shirley.
Well, the Bible also says that the guilty person can say, I'm sorry, and if the one that's innocent accepts that apology, they can get back together. We've seen that happen.
Right. So you can have compassion, right? That is possible. You can make things up. But we know that Israel had a problem with hard hearts, right? And even in the New Testament, we see that this was the one acceptable reason for divorce because of the hardness of their heart, right? Shirley, you.
Well, I'm just sitting here thinking with adultery, that is a personal matter.
Sure.
With stealing for food, that's entirely different.
Right. Yeah, it's not as personal as adultery, right?
Right. It's not a personal thing.
Right.
Or the Bible, but
right.
The Bible says you become one with that person,
Right.
So you're really, it's a deep emotional thing. And
for sure.
And it's sinful if that's not your mate.
Right, exactly. So what we see is that Solomon kind of sums it up in the next line here. He says, one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense, right? Especially because Solomon's giving the warning here. It says, he who would destroy himself commits it. So it's self-destructive behavior, right? If you do this, you're dumb because it's only hurting, well, it's not only hurting you, but you're hurting yourself by doing this, right? Other people are hurt too, but this is destroying you. That's what he's saying. Right?
Yeah, totally, that kind of thing totally pollutes the idea of what Adam's mentioned. We become one, right? We're married to our spouse. And so you're really polluting that relationship with like a foreign matter. And it's just, it drives everybody crazy. It's not good at all.
Right.
Thus the destroying yourself.
Right. And so that's Solomon's key takeaway here is that adultery is self-destructive and it's a foolish thing to do, right? So like all of these things, Solomon is trying to set his sons up for success in life. He's trying to show them these are things that will lead down a bad path and get you into trouble. Here's how to avoid them or get out of it, right? And so in this case, the answer is to avoid it, right? All right. That's the end of chapter 6. So we just had that one little last bit to go through there in chapter 6. So let's go ahead and turn with me. Yeah, go ahead.
You know the old saying about don't do as I do, do as I say?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would be Solomon.
Well, right. But also remember when Solomon wrote this versus what we see later in life, right? So we know that Solomon had this wisdom. He understood these things. Now, of course, we have the benefit of seeing further down the road into how Solomon's life turned out. And we can see that while he understood these lessons at one point, he did stray from it and ignored it, right? And I would say that, a lot of people ask a similar question like, well, how could such a wise man who knew this fall down that path? And I think the answer there lies in diligence, right? Because even the wisest people are not immune to sin. And so that's one of the reasons that we have to continue to come to church. You can't say, well, I've read the Bible 3 or 4 times and I know what it says and I don't need to go to church because I know what it says and I'm good. I'll be okay, right? Anybody can fall into sin no matter how wise you are. So we always have to be constantly examining ourselves and constantly looking inward. Go ahead, Abby.
Well, I don't know if I can explain this right, but Solomon's time also, they could have multiple wives. I mean,
right.
It was not uncommon to have several wives.
Right.
So in his mind, maybe he didn't see that as sin.
Sure.
You know, that's just my reasoning. I don't know.
Yeah, it's easy to see how Solomon could have easily justified that. In their time, it was permitted to have multiple wives. What Solomon was also not on guard with was against adultery, right? And so if you look back earlier in the Old Testament, there's actually a warning for what kings should do versus other men. They weren't to acquire multiple wives. They were not to amass chariots or many horses, I think is what it says, which you might wonder, that's a strange thing for a king, but it had to do with military might.
Yeah.
It was another way of, in their time, chariots were like tanks, right? And so it was, don't put all your trust in military might. Well, Solomon acquired many horses, right? And there was a third one that's not coming to my mind right now, but Solomon broke that one too. So there were multiple things that kings were supposed to be on guard against, and unfortunately, Solomon wasn't, right? Rick?
Yeah, and he's still human, and temptation comes after us all.
Right.
You know,
That's what I was talking
once
about.
you start falling off the path and doing something, then it's easy to get caught up in it. You know?
But I think
Yeah.
he was justifying.
Yeah, he absolutely could have been, right? It's hard to say, you know, why Solomon ended up down that route, even though he had this wisdom. So, but again, I would say it's a warning for us that we need to be diligent about applying this wisdom and keeping it close. Pat?
Not only is adultery being wrong, but he also murdered her husband.
I think you're thinking of David now.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I am.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Another good example against lust, right? Absolutely applies. It can get you into other problems as well. But in that case, that was David and Bathsheba. Yeah. All right. Let's see. All right. So if you want to go ahead and turn with me, if you haven't already, into Proverbs chapter 7. Proverbs chapter 7. And we're going to get into Solomon's last speech. After this speech, we'll have 2 more poems about Lady Wisdom, and then he gets into the meat of all the Proverbs, what we normally think of as Proverbs. Okay? So, just a little recap. So far, we've had 9 speeches and 2 poems, all talking about the importance of wisdom. And so we come to this last of Solomon's 10 speeches here in this book, and he's talking about adultery again. Now you might say, well, hold on. I know Solomon's kind of mentioned it here and there, but didn't we already have a speech on adultery? Well, we did. We already had that. That was speech number 8. He talked about adultery. Okay. And he just kind of touched on it in his last speech. So why is Solomon talking about it again? It's an important thing for sure. Rick?
It's one of the biggest temptations we all face through life. It's this idea of seeing something and lusting after
Yeah.
it. We're talking about people now.
Right.
A lot of emotion built into that.
Yeah. I would say that, it's such a common temptation to all people, but especially young people, right? I would say and Solomon's talking to his sons, don't forget. So for young men, this is probably one of the most challenging temptations that we know that they're going to go through, right? And so Solomon's giving another warning, which should impress upon you how important he thought it was for his sons to hear this. Shirley, did you have?
I'm just going to say, none of us are exempt.
Right.
Being reminded.
Right. Exactly.
No matter what your age.
Exactly. And so far Solomon's given some speeches on this. He's referenced it in other speeches, and it's just to emphasize the danger of this one, okay? So, as you read through chapter 7, keep an eye out for some of the words that Solomon uses, okay? You'll notice he uses lots of these action words. He says keep, he says that 3 times, treasure, bind, write, say, call. He wants his sons to take diligent action In other words, none of these are passive things. These are all actions for a person to do. Okay, so to be diligent about this requires action on our part. That's what I want to stress. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 to 3. He says in Proverbs 7, verses 1 to 3, "My son, keep my words and treasure my commandments within you. Keep my commandments and live, and my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers and write them on the tablet of your heart." This is really nothing new. This is that same idea that he's using before of keeping words close, wearing them like jewelry. He also says to keep them in your heart, right? Write them on your heart. Keep them close. And there's an abundance of verses that talk about the importance of the state of our heart, right? Part of that is keeping wisdom within it, right? And there were so many verses that I had a hard time choosing just one. But all throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, it talks about what condition our heart is in, right? If your heart is full of wickedness, then that's what's coming out of your heart. If your heart is full of righteousness, then that's what's coming out of you, right? The inner state of your heart is what drives so many of your actions. We hear verses about hard-heartedness, right? And we don't want to be like that. And we want hearts of flesh, soft hearts, right? That Jesus talks about later in the New Testament. There's so many verses about this. And so part of keeping that good state of your heart is holding wisdom close to it. Okay. Now, Solomon here, he's going to compare wisdom to two people, or you might say two relationships, okay? Look at verses 4 and 5. "Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your intimate friend, so that they may keep you from an adulteress, from the foreigner who flatters with her words." Okay? So what are the two people that Solomon compares wisdom to? Sister, and what was the other one?
The kin.
And your kin, yeah. Or
New King James Version says
nearest kin, intimate friend, same idea. Like you have people close to you, right? So the idea is that wisdom is like this close advisor that you have, as close as a close friend or a close relative who's able to be there and to advise you and prevent you from making a bad choice, right? One of the very first speech that Solomon talked about was the dangers of bad company, right? You don't want bad advisors who are going to egg you on to make bad choices. You want good advisors to help you make smart decisions. Again, that's part of the reason that we come to church, right? Being around other Christians here in the building and out as we live our lives, they can encourage us to make smart decisions, not to make those bad decisions. And so he's saying that wisdom is like them. Wisdom is like having two very close advisors, right? Who are there to help you avoid the adulteress, to avoid bad decisions. Okay? So we just went over that slide. Okay. Now, one more thing. Let's go over this before we close for tonight. If you look at verse 5, we're going to get into one of the Hebrew words here for just a minute. The word that it uses here, in the translation I'm using from the New American Standard, it says the foreigner. The Hebrew word here is nakri, okay? King James translates that as strange woman. The New King James says immoral woman. The New American Standard says foreigner, and the CSB says forbidden woman, okay? So you notice they're very similar, but they're all a little different, okay? And usually what happens when you see that in translations is that we just don't have a word that really in English fits the whole meaning of it. But you kind of get the idea by looking at all these together, what he's talking about. Basically, Solomon is speaking to the adulterous nature of this woman, not her nationality. She's the forbidden fruit kind of thing. That's what he's going after. Right?
Yeah, in other words, if I was going to say it simply, she's not yours.
Exactly.
Right? That's the thing.
Right.
She's not yours.
She's not yours. That's what is meant. Like when you see strange in the King James, in old language, strange could just mean not yours, like you said, right? Immoral, well, if she's an adulteress, again, she's not yours. You don't need to be engaging in immoral behavior. Foreign, like a foreign object, right? Again, not yours or forbidden. That is the idea of this. And so as you read that, keep that in mind. The Bible doesn't have anything against other nationalities. The Hebrew people were told to set themselves apart, and it was more to keep out idolatry than it was God disliking any kind of other nation or anything like that. We see in the New Testament that when we get into the book of Revelation, that in heaven we have people from every nation, every tribe, every tongue, right? People from all over the world are going to be in heaven. It's not exclusive to just one nationality, all right? All of us being Gentiles should be very appreciative of that, right? So that's a good thing for all of us. So I just wanted to call that out there. And if you're curious, if you do want to see some examples of the Old Testament talking about foreigners in a good way, think about Ruth. Ruth has a whole book titled after her, and it talks about her story. Well, who was Ruth? She was a Moabite, right? And Rick just went over where the Moabites came from in his most recent Genesis lesson, right? So you should remember that. If you don't, Moabites sprang up from an incestuous relationship with Lot and one of his daughters, right? And yet, who descended down through Ruth? Jesus Christ, right? God's message is for everyone, right? Solomon here is using language to talk about the adulterous, forbidden, not yours nature of that woman. So just wanted to clarify that before we close for tonight. So we'll get deeper into Solomon's last speech here, Lord willing, next week. Thank you, everyone.